All right, let's talk about Blackbeard. You probably have an image in your head, right? The fearsome pirate, the buried treasure, the whole skull and crossbones thing. But today, we're going to dig into the real history. And what we're going to find is a story that's way more surprising and, honestly, a lot more interesting than the legend.
This right here, this is basically the image that created our modern idea of a pirate. The sea chest, the secret map, digging by moonlight. But get this, it was painted over 150 years after Blackbeard died. It's a powerful, romantic vision for sure, but it has completely shaped how we see piracy.
So let's just strip all that away. Because the reality of the Golden Age of Piracy isn't a story about chaos and buried gold. Turns out, it's a story of business, of rebellion, and of a surprisingly organized society.
To really get to the truth, we first have to compare the pirate ship we see in the movies with how these crews actually set themselves up. And wow, the difference is pretty staggering.
I mean, just look at this. This comparison completely flips the script. A pirate ship wasn't some floating anarchy, it was more like a floating republic. It was a direct rebellion against the brutal top-down command of merchant and navy ships, where captains had absolute power and crews were, frankly, treated horribly.
Yeah, you heard that right. Democratically elected. Can you imagine being a sailor who just escaped some tyrannical merchant captain? The chance to actually vote for your leader, and even vote him out if he was cruel or incompetent, that was a radical kind of freedom. They basically created a system of checks and balances at sea.
And every crew member had to sign the ship's articles, a written code of conduct. And these codes weren't just about punishments. They had provisions that were unbelievably progressive for the time, like a form of workers' compensation for injuries you got in battle.
This number comes from the articles of a pirate named Bartholomew Roberts. If you lost your right arm in a fight, you were guaranteed 8 extra shares of the plunder. This was an early form of disability insurance, created by outlaws that was around more than a century before most official governments even thought of it.
Now, this level of organization wasn't just about being fair, it was crucial for running a successful, if illegal, business. Because piracy didn't just happen in a vacuum, it was a direct result of the global economy at the time.
See, back in the 17th and 18th centuries, laws like the Navigation Acts forced colonists to trade only with England at super high prices. This created a huge black market. So a lot of pirates actually started as smugglers, giving colonists cheaper goods. They weren't just randomly stealing, they were filling a market demand.
And here's where the line gets really blurry. During the constant wars between European powers, governments would issue letters of marque. This was basically a license for a private ship to attack enemy vessels. You were, for all intents and purposes, a state-sponsored pirate. These sailors were called privateers.
And this created what you might call the privateer to pirate pipeline. When a war ended, suddenly you had thousands of trained, armed sailors out of a job. With very few options, a lot of them just kept doing what they were good at, only now without official permission. They just became pirates.
But for all their organization and their economic cleverness, we can't forget this was a violent life. And for anyone who got caught, the end was almost always swift, very public, and absolutely brutal.
After Blackbeard was killed in battle, his surviving crew didn't last long at all. They were captured, locked up for 3 months, and then put on trial. The verdict? Well, that was a done deal. Justice here was meant to be terrifying.
Just try to picture this for a second. The authorities didn't just execute them. They made a gruesome spectacle out of their deaths, lining the main road with their bodies as a warning to anyone else who might be thinking about a life of piracy. This wasn't a romantic adventure. It was a deadly gamble.
So the real pirate turns out to be a much more complex figure, right? Part Democrat, part businessman, part outlaw. So now let's go back to Blackbeard himself and just totally dismantle the 2 biggest myths that still define him today.
The story usually goes that Blackbeard's famous flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was tragically lost when it ran aground. But what if? What if he wrecked it on purpose?
Well, the archaeology from the wreck tells a very different story. The ship was already in really bad shape when Blackbeard captured it. Records show it leaked all the time, and divers have found these lead patches used for emergency repairs. So running it aground might have been a smart move to get rid of a high-maintenance asset and maybe even downsize his crew.
And as the lead archaeologist on the project puts it, this probably wasn't a mistake. It was likely a pragmatic business decision. This reframes Blackbeard not just as a reckless pirate, but as a manager making a tough call about a failing piece of equipment.
And that brings us to the biggest myth of them all, the one that really started this whole story. Blackbeard's massive buried treasure.
After his death, the authorities seized everything he and his crew owned. They added up the value of all the sugar, cocoa, cotton, and gold dust they found. The grand total? About 2,500 pounds sterling. Now, that was a decent chunk of change for the time, enough to live on for years. But for a legendary pirate king, it's kinda underwhelming.
In fact, when you compare Blackbeard's fortune to other pirates of the era, he was pretty small time. Captain Kidd was caught with over 5 times as much, and Sam Bellamy, who captured the slave ship Whydah, might have had a fortune worth £1 million. Blackbeard was famous for his terrifying image, not for his wealth.
So, where did the myth even come from? It mostly comes from this one super dramatic line in a popular 1724 book called A General History of the Pirates. That one quote, combined with fiction like Treasure Island later on, created a legend that was way more powerful than the boring reality.
You know, the real treasure was never actually buried in the sand. It's been made over the last 300 years by selling us the exciting, romantic, and very profitable story of the pirate, a story that has very little to do with the truth.
So this leaves us with a final thought. Maybe the real treasure isn't a chest full of gold. Maybe it's the true story, this fascinating look into a group of people who, just for a moment, created their own rules and their own society on the high seas. And that story, that might just be worth more than any legend.